morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Wednesday, February 16th, 2022. And on this episode, I've got a big picture overview of the top 5 strategies that we see that you can use to nullify federal acts in practice and effect, even if they stay on the books in Washington, D.C. This way, individuals, cities, and states can take part in doing their duty, doing their job, enforcing the limits of the Constitution on the federal government without waiting for the federal government to somehow magically limit its own power, which never, ever happens. Well, maybe, but it really almost never happens. We live under the largest government in the history of the world, so if it was limiting its own power, if voting the bums out or begging them to stop doing stuff that they're already doing or to start doing stuff that they haven't been doing or going to federal courts was working, we wouldn't be living under the largest government in the history of the world. So let's get to it. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow us. That is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You're going to find all the archives of the show. We're closing in on 4 years of doing this 3 times a week-ish. We have on individual episodes, I publish a blog post for every single episode 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is over. And there you're going to find all the different platforms we're on. We have a bunch of different video platforms. We live stream, of course, on the mainstream ones, plus Odyssey.com, ODYSEE.com, the best one out there. It's decentralized and at least censorship resistant in comparison to the others, which are not at all. We also archive all over the place as well, video versions. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition pretty much everywhere. Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and the rest. And all the reviews on the podcast that you guys have been leaving really help us a lot. It actually, every time you do that, we start reaching more people. There's something in the algorithm that those types of actions actually help out. And then, of course, we also have our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month over at, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us in the live chat or on the live stream, I've noticed a lot of times people are telling me, I didn't get a notification until 5 minutes after the show, or it didn't show up until the next day or something like that. So we got to give them at least a couple of minutes. We're not going to wait for the whole show. I want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat. Dixie Strong in Alabama. Favorite days of the week, says Dixie. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Smash that like button. Thank you so much. Justin Morrison, hi back to you. Jennifer Coop, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri. Clay Kent, Richard Banks in Fredonia, Kansas. Tyler B. Yeah, it has been a long while since we've seen you live. Hope everything's doing good. We got Joey's Code in Arkansas. Hopefully I got the name right finally. Ed Hen, Bonehead, Israel. Haji in Oakland County, Michigan. Vincent in Tampa, good to see you, man. Veritas von Liberabit in Jacksonville. Well, I live in commie LA, so there's no comparison. Anyways, Patricia Dance in Syracuse. I appreciate you all being here. I apologize if I missed anybody, but let's start out with the information that you're hopefully here for. How do we stop the federal government without relying on the federal government to limit its own power? And how do we do it now rather than waiting for something that may take 5 or 10 or 15 years? We have to be able to take action immediately. And James Madison talked about this specifically in a paper, in Federalist Paper number 46. He gave us a 4-step plan, 4 things that individuals, cities, and states, or cities, when I talk about cities and states, I really shouldn't make that clarification, but maybe it's important because when you talk about a state, you're also talking about its political subdivisions. And political subdivisions are states and counties and towns and all that stuff, even in home rule states. So you can use the same type of approach. So Madison, in Federalist 46, told us what to do. And he said that there were things like state legislation. He called them legislative devices. He mentioned noncompliance of the people. And then also a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Madison told us, if a number of states use this together, these strategies, including governors talking out against, governors probably are the least important part of this, but governors can bring a lot of attention to the fact that the federal government is overstepping, and they start talking up about it, and hey, our state needs to do this, we need to opt out of participation. That can have a big impact politically, or at least in the messaging, at least to the mainstream media will probably attack it, of course. That's what they always do if you talk about limiting government power. But this is Madison's strategy. He said, if a bunch of states do this, several adjoining states, he said, it would create an environment the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. And mind you, Opting out, refusing to comply, non-compliant, state legislation, these were tools that would be really effective against a federal government under the proposed Constitution. He's talking about this in Federalist 46. That is totally unrecognizable in comparison to what we live under today. A limited delegated power Constitution that was a larger government than what would have been under the Articles of Confederation, and to some people significantly so. But still, if we would map this out on a chart, the amount of power that the federal government was supposed to have originally compared to what it has stolen or what the people have begged for, the people have allowed for so many years, it is no comparison. So the idea that opting out, refusing to comply was effective then, it's far more effective today because we know for sure the federal government relies on states and localities to implement and enforce almost all federal acts and regulatory programs. I'm not going to get into too much detail on that right now, but I will link to that article in the show notes. That is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And if you happen to be listening to the show and you're like, hey, Bolden, where can I find that article you mentioned about James Madison? Well, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Just look for the blog post for this episode, and there will be a link to this in the links section. So James Madison. Let's get to the 5 strategies. 1 is ban enforcement on a state and local level. So state legislation to ban participating in the enforcement or implementation of a federal act or regulatory program, or even merely helping, providing material support and resources to the implementation of a federal act. And has this worked? Can this work? Is anyone doing this? And I think we have to really start out with immigration sanctuary cities and immigration sanctuary states. And I know a lot of supporters of our work here don't like these jurisdictions. They're against them. But no one is against immigration sanctuary jurisdictions because their feelings are hurt. Well, I sure hope not. They don't like the language that's being passed in San Francisco or California or in Boston or wherever else they have these jurisdictions. They complain because the states or localities are refusing to help enforce federal immigration law, and it has a significant impact on the federal capabilities to enforce federal immigration law because the federal government is so busy doing so many other things it shouldn't be doing. It is literally begging localities to help them enforce maybe one thing that they should be doing. I don't know. And there are some arguments about that if you're talking about Jefferson and Madison as well, but we're not going to get into that today. But if you believe the federal government should be enforcing federal immigration laws, why are they doing so much other stuff that they shouldn't be doing, and then they're not capable of doing this? And that leaves them with an Achilles heel on almost every federal program. We've seen studies that have shown that in places like California, mere noncompliance with participating in the enforcement of just the civil aspects of federal immigration law, not the criminal aspects of it, but civil aspects, have reduced deportations in jurisdictions from 30, 50, sometimes 60%. And then it's not just immigration, though. We are starting to see, and we've been pushing for this for many, many years, and I've covered this on this show many times. I'm sure you're probably tired of hearing about it, but we are using the 10th Amendment, this approach of refusing to cooperate, looking at what they've done on immigration and said, well, instead of spending all our time trying to shut that down, we're going to spend our time trying to actually protect and defend the natural rights of the people, using the 10th Amendment, using Madison's approach to defend and advance the natural right to keep and bear arms and shut down and nullify all federal gun control. We're finally starting to see a couple of states move forward on that, specifically Missouri and Arizona. The reason we know this works is Missouri, after 8 years of trying, they finally passed this Second Amendment Preservation Act. And the DOJ absolutely hates it. The Department of Justice is at it in court, in state court. It's likely they're going to lose on the constitutional question in state court, so they're probably going to file a federal court. They really just want to shut it down. And the supporters of the monster state, whether it's the law enforcement lobby groups or the unions or the police chiefs and sheriffs, the big people that are driving the policy and that love the federal loot that comes with it, they're complaining because the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act is already severing relationships between Missouri agencies, law enforcement, state patrol, things like that, and the federal ATF. And that is exactly what it's supposed to do. And that's why they're so aggressively against this, because this works. Madison told us this would work. And when people actually listen and start doing it, We see the impact because the feds are pissed. And I covered this in much more detail in a recent episode last fall. Partnerships don't work when half the team quits. It's not just James Madison. I also covered other founders like Roger Sherman, and I even looked at the big government guy of the time, Alexander Hamilton, who recognized that if you have to rely on the states to implement a federal act, then the states merely just do nothing. They just stop helping, and then the act is defeated. Even Alexander Hamilton recognized this. I think it was in Federalist number 16 off the top of my head. He wasn't saying it was a good thing like Madison and Sherman were. He was complaining about it. But we can recognize that this is a very, very effective strategy, especially today. Again, I will link to that in the show notes. So the first strategy is for states to ban enforcement, participation on various federal acts or regulatory programs. Say, well, if you guys want to do this, you figure it out. And they normally cannot. The ATF, we know, for example, has somewhere around 5,500 employees for the entire country. Sometimes it's as low as 51. Sometimes it gets up to around 6,000. I'm not sure if the current administration tried to push it up. Generally, they have a difficult time expanding the size of these agencies. They go up just briefly, but then over a period of years, or the small numbers, they go up small numbers, but over a number of years, then all of a sudden you're like, well, how did it get to 15,000? But at its current capacity, year in and year out, it has the ability to investigate and close somewhere around 8,000 and 10,000 firearms cases per year. Now, that's a lot. That's 10,000 people being prosecuted, convicted possibly for a federal firearms law. And under the Constitution, we know, and under the Second Amendment, we know that the number of federal gun control measures that are authorized is this number: 0, none, not a single one. So every single one of those, if someone was supposed to be prosecuted or for a different crime, that should be happening at a state level, not a federal level, never at a federal level. So 10,000 is 10,000 too many. It should be 0. But if you think about it, let's say there were 13 million, 14 million undocumented short-barreled shotguns in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934. Just think, doing a thought experiment here. If there were 10,000 compared to 13 million is almost nothing. We can nullify this in practice and effect. So number one is ban enforcement. Number two, the states should states or local communities, of course, and the same thing goes with number one. Number two is legalize what the federal government prohibits. The federal government claims the power to tell you what type of self-defense tool you can have and own and make or print, for example. They tell you that what kind of things you can grow in your own home and consume in your backyard. They tell you what size toilet you can have, what kind of light bulbs. So they're prohibiting you from having all kinds of stuff all the time. And we know that with 37 states to some degree, 37 states to some degree have legalized a plant, cannabis, that the federal government at every level says is illegal. Congress says cannabis is illegal. The judicial branch says cannabis is illegal. They held against the states in the Gonzalez versus Raich case in 2005, written an opinion written by the great conservative Justice Scalia, garbage, who claimed that having 6 plants in your own backyard that were never bought or sold, you were given the seeds, they weren't taken across state line, was somehow interstate commerce. And that means the federal commerce power is unlimited. Clarence Thomas warned against that in that 2005 case. So, but there's still in spite of that, 37 states have legalized a plant that the federal government and the executive branch, all those branches think is illegal. So I think it becomes pretty obvious to this point, and I mentioned it back in a video in 2015 or so, that within so many people finding the winning path, people and states and communities have found the winning path, it's only a matter of time before the federal government backs off of its prohibition on cannabis just to save face. They don't want anyone to know that this is happening because of the states. They're going to claim at some point, well, we're legalizing and regulating and all this other garbage that they shouldn't do, when they should just get the hell out of the way. Now, we also saw it wasn't just that part of the cannabis plant, the sister plant, the hemp plant got legalized when the previous president, the previous administration signed a farm bill into law. I think it was the 2018 Farm Bill. There was a lot of unconstitutional regulatory garbage in that, just like it is every time they pass one of those things, all kinds of grant programs that shouldn't exist and slush fund, basically bribe money that shouldn't exist. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. But this only happened after 17, maybe 18 states had already legalized it. We saw the same thing with CBD. So people are legalizing on the state level what the feds say they can't. They did this in some ways with alcohol prohibition. They stopped enforcement. They didn't necessarily legalize on the state level, but they did version number 1. Now we're seeing the same type of thing happening today. And then over time, when enough people in enough states are doing this, the feds are basically like, well, okay, we might as well get in on the game and try to look good. And that is really a very successful path forward so far. But we also have things that I think are very important to discuss, like permitless or constitutional carry. Here's from a blog post on a bill in Alabama that Mike Meharry reported on recently. And he said, while permitless carry bills do not directly affect federal gun control, the widespread passage of permitless concealed carry laws, or just permitless carry laws in states, subtly undermines federal efforts to regulate guns. As we've seen with marijuana and industrial hemp, a federal regulation becomes ineffective when states ignore it and pass laws encouraging the prohibited activity anyway. So the more that people have an environment of personal responsibility and self-defense, our natural right to keep and bear arms, the more that is encouraged on a state or local level, the more difficult it becomes politically as well for the federal government to implement a new ban. Less restrictive state laws, Mike writes, will likely have a similar impact on federal gun laws. It will make it that much more difficult for the feds to enforce any future federal gun control and increase the likelihood that states with few limits will simply refuse to cooperate with federal enforcement efforts. So this is a big part of it, constitutional or permitless carry. We can also have the same type of messaging on raw milk. The federal government claims not only the power to ban the interstate commerce of raw milk, which I would take the position they do not have the authority to do that under the Commerce Clause, but most people purchasing raw milk, they want to get it locally because it's not pasteurized, and if you want to do safe handling, you want to get it locally. So an interstate ban doesn't have too much of an effect. But HHS or FDA has also said in a lawsuit, they've also taken the position that the federal government not only has the power to do interstate bans, but they believe that they can ban raw milk production, sale, consumption intrastate, within a state. So we can have the same type of approach. And Meharry puts it this way in another report on a Georgia raw milk bill that we're following this year. If all 50 states allow raw milk, markets within the states could easily grow to the point that local sales would render the federal ban on interstate commerce pointless. Doesn't matter. I mean, if the feds are saying, well, you can't transport it across state lines, but you can get it at your local market anywhere in your neighborhood anyways, I mean, it still is an impact, but it's very small. He says, and history indicates that the feds do not have the resources to stop people from transporting milk across state lines as well, especially if multiple states start legalizing it. Growing markets will quickly overwhelm any federal enforcement attempts. So that's number 2. So number 1, ban enforcement on a state or local level. Number 2, legalize what the federal government prohibits. But number 3, I think, is the most important one of them. It doesn't matter. It's non-compliance by the people. It does not matter how many state or local laws exist that ban the feds from or ban enforcement of a federal act on a state or a local level. It doesn't matter how many of those get passed or how many states legalize stuff that the feds prohibit. So it doesn't matter how many you get of number 1 or number 2 if you don't have number 3. Because if the population at large still decides overall to follow federal law rather than to violate federal law under the possible protection or the umbrella of state law. If they continue following the federal law, nothing gets nullified. There is none. It doesn't matter. They're not banning enforcement of anything because everyone is complying. We're hearing a lot more people say the types of things that we've been saying for years. You cannot comply your way out of the largest government in the history of the world. John Dickinson, in his broadside urging resistance to the Stamp Act in 1765, he specifically said, if you comply with the act, by using their stamped papers, you voluntarily, you unnecessarily rivet perpetual chains around your unhappy country. This sets the precedent for them to do more. And so because the feds don't have the resources to enforce on their own, having the refusal to enforce on a state level, legalizing on a state level, which is another version of that, but just addressing different issues, plus mass noncompliance, that is something what James Madison told us in Federalist 46 would render basically a situation that the federal government can't handle. I covered this in much more detail in another recent episode. Compliance is violence, because not only is it self-harm, but you're doing violence upon future generations, because as Dickinson told us, it sets the precedent for them to continue doing the enforcement if they do, or they need to, or they expand on the precedent. If they get one law in that tells you can't do something that you should be able to, like exercising your natural right to defend your home and your family, or to grow a plant, for example, if they're banning you from going to work or maybe entering a business, then they're going to do more. Every time they do it, Dickinson called it a detestable precedent. And we know that power always seeks to expand. So compliance, it may not be violence on yourself, but it is violence on others and future generations. The episode is Compliance is Violence. Dickinson, John Dickinson, penman of the Revolution, and the great 19th century anarchist Lysander Spooner on the path to liberty. That was just January 3rd of this year. Of course, I will link to it in the show notes. So we've got 3 now. 1, ban enforcement on a state or local level. 2, legalize what the feds prohibit. 3, the most important one. Maybe I should have put it as 1, but I thought it flowed well like this. Number 3 is non-compliance by the people, and it needs to happen in a big way. Number 4 for states and, again, localities is reject the federal bribe money. We have so much money being stolen from the people and then purchasing power stolen through the printing press. So, I just thought of this, but rejecting federal bribe money probably also includes rejecting their monetary system completely. We know there are ways to do that. It's not easy for everybody, but there certainly are. But federal funding, federal grant programs, federal programs of every type, they all come with federal strings. We know this. Federal requirements. So as soon as they start taking that money, they can be coerced into doing stuff. And I know this is a tough one. This might be one of the most difficult ones out there because politicians at every level, they love loot. The more cash that they have on hand, the more that they can spend, the more they can put up billboards in your neighborhood or run local radio ads or whatever it may be, banner ads or social media, talking about how they were able to get money to build a bike lane or improve these housing communities or whatever it may be, expand law enforcement. And they will brag about that and they will run for re-election on that, and they do that all the time in almost every jurisdiction. But we are starting to actually see a glimmer of hope. I'm actually surprised that this is starting to happen. Maybe I just haven't studied enough to pay attention. We did see some HUD funding refused by local communities a few years ago, but then that kind of went away. Now, during this pandemic funding issue, we're seeing dozens of localities just around Texas actually rejecting the federal bribe money because they did not want to sign on to an almost open-ended contract to have to enforce basically any executive order related to it going forward in perpetuity. So dozens of small towns started to reject that in the last couple of years in Texas and elsewhere. I did an episode on that last fall, dozens of small towns reject federal bribe money. I think it's an important part of our path forward. It's an important piece of the puzzle of these 5 strategies. I will link to that in the show notes. And then Mike Meharry just did an interview with Reason Magazine on the same issue, and they actually covered it more broadly around the country, and they pointed out that more than 240 small towns across the U.S. have rejected federal money in order to avoid the inevitable strings attached. It's only a 3-minute video. I will link to that blog post in the show notes as well. So we're starting to see that happen. But it's not just the federal grant programs on health issues or on other things. It's a lot of stuff. We also have the federal asset forfeiture program called equitable sharing. This is basically legalized government theft. It's highway robbery. I'm not going to cover asset forfeiture specifically right now, but I do have an episode that I did that I think covers this pretty well, how asset forfeiture drives the police state. What's important for us to recognize here is the equitable sharing program, the federal asset forfeiture program. It's a tool for the federal government to steal money and bribe local law enforcement into doing federal stuff, federal priorities. So if a state ends civil asset forfeiture, but they don't opt out of the federal equitable sharing program, here's what happens. Someone pulls over a car and they see some cash or some property in there, and they're like, well, this person might be a drug dealer. we should rip them off. And we know this type of thing does happen, absolutely. And I'm just giving kind of a very simple example here. And the state says you can't do it without a criminal conviction, but then they'll say, well, let's do it under federal law. We've got similar federal laws. We'll call up our buddies, our federal partners in the DEA or the ATF, two federal agencies among many that should never have existed in the first place. They should be stores, not federal agencies. And they say, well, looks like we got ourselves a drug case. That's illegal federally. Can this be a federal case? And they do what's called transferring. They transfer the case to the federal government. Is no longer then a state law case, and therefore state restrictions on civil asset forfeiture no longer have any impact. They are now working on a joint task force. That is not necessarily a pun this time. Maybe it is, a joint task force with the federal government. They're actually, the local law enforcement then just continues investigating the same supposed crime, the alleged crime, the same way they would do it under state law, but now they're helping the federal government. They have one or two federal agents involved directing things, and then they take the stuff. They don't need a criminal conviction because the feds don't require that. Then the feds get all the money, and they divvy out generally about 80% of it to local law enforcement. And don't you think that cash-strapped law enforcement agencies, who are only cash-strapped because they're trying to enforce too much stuff that they shouldn't be enforcing in the first place, you can defund these most of these agencies down to almost nothing if they were just following the Constitution instead of doing all kinds of other regulatory garbage that they should never be doing in the first place, the gun control and all that other stuff. And so then they divvy out the cash. And what do you think? Well, if your option is, well, we can fund the budget with civil asset forfeiture or by helping the feds, or we can do this low-level crime, or we can deal with things on a local level, what do you think the priority is going to be? And I think this is why we see places like Institute for Justice call it policing for profit. I will link to that in the show notes. But as I also mentioned, there's joint task forces. There are literally hundreds of these things. And local law, there's like 500 joint state federal task forces out there. And when local law enforcement participates in a federal joint task force, they are almost always deputized as federal agents. And so then therefore they get federal priorities, federal strings, federal cash, and federal enforcement powers. And this is a real problem. I have another episode on that, state federal task forces and the national police state. So they have to reject the cash in the direct grants. They have to opt out of the civil asset forfeiture program, and then they have to sever the relationships with probably almost all the federal task forces, because most federal crimes shouldn't exist in the first place. These should be state level ones. And that's what we see the problem or the attack against the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act, because so many local law enforcement or state-level law enforcement agencies are opting out of various federal task forces, and now the supporters of the monster state don't like that. That means it should be a green light to do more and more and more. So number 4 is reject the federal bribe money, and number 5 kind of goes with all of them. It's a big one. Maybe it's harder to do than rejecting the bribe money because we're seeing more of it happen, less of it happen than rejecting the bribe money. But that's ban the sharing and provision of material support or resources to federal acts or regulatory programs. We know that some federal programs like NSA mass warrantless surveillance, for example, rely on the federal government to set up, or the federal agency to set up facilities in multiple states. The NSA has facilities in West Virginia, in Georgia, in Tennessee, in Texas, in San Antonio, in an old giant Sony factory, a warehouse that's just a couple of miles down the line from a Microsoft data center, so it's easy to tie into it. Or in Washington State, in Colorado, there's a listening station in Washington State. There's another one in Colorado. There's a code-breaking one in Tennessee. Then, of course, the big one that most people know about, the NSA data center in Bluffdale, Utah. And that type of a situation, when they set up these facilities, they're relying on the provision of basics, water, electricity, sometimes garbage cleanup, sewage, and things like that from the state. Almost in every situation. They don't often buy these services from private companies. In Texas, for example, they use the independent power grid to power the NSA data center in San Antonio. In NSA Bluffdale, Utah, they're getting water. They predicted it would go up to about 1.5 or so million gallons of water per day. And if you turn it off, well, it's difficult to turn it off once you've set the contract. But if you ban the provision of these material support or resources in states where there aren't facilities, then they can't set up shop. It becomes almost impossible for them to set up shop. We're boxing them in and shutting them down. And then you also want to pass it banning material support and resources. We lifted that language from the Patriot Act because it is a very broad meaning in law. The provision of material support or resources, person power, money, any type of supplies, etc., would be prohibited. And you can do that in places like Utah and Texas, even where they already have active contracts basically saying they cannot be renewed after the 5 years is up. And so you're boxing them in and shutting them down. And I know a lot of people think, well, that's kind of crazy. You're going to shut off water to a federal government facility. Well, hell yeah. They haven't followed the Constitution in generations, not even close. Why should we help them violate our rights? I mean, the idea that government runs water and power in the first place is real problematic if you believe in liberty. So then at least why not use that as a chess piece? And it's not just in theory that this can be done. We know it has already been done. And I did an episode on this actually 3 years ago, just in the past week, how one state turned off water to the feds and won. We know that Nevada actually did this with the Department of Energy, and it went to federal court, the whole thing. And they were able to shut down a federal program there. I will link to that in the show notes. So we know that there are 5 main ways, 5 main strategies for states, localities, and most importantly, individuals to take on federal acts and to box them in and shut them down, to nullify their acts. Don't rely on them to do the stuff that we think they should do, because they won't. So we've got ban enforcement on a state or a local level, legalize what the feds prohibit, mass non-compliance by the people, reject the federal loot, and then ban material support or resources. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I will look in the live chat here in just a moment, see if there's any questions I can answer. But I do want to mention that we absolutely could use your help. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that helps us reach and teach more and more people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend them both more than the financial faith and support of our members. I see a bunch of people who are members already in the live chat. I can't be thankful enough. I cannot express my gratitude enough for that. But our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month, and you can join us today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also help us out, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, by leaving a review on any of the podcast platforms, primarily Apple. And then, of course, on the video platforms, smashing the like button, leaving comments in the archive, sharing the links, subscribing, getting notifications. All that stuff will trigger the algorithms and tell them to show the show to more people. I want to take a look in the chat and see if there's any questions out there. Ed Hen said you should get in contact with this awesome fella named Chili on his channel Delete Laws. He's awesome and knows laws too well. He's an auditor and wants to be governor of California. Man, I couldn't imagine being governor of anywhere. I appreciate you mentioning that. If you want to send an email on that, team at 10thamendmentcenter.com. I'm always interested in making more contacts. I appreciate it, Ed. Clay Kent says, awesome as usual. I appreciate that. Veritas von Liberabit says it boils down to electing constitutional candidates locally. Getting one to run is often a difficult task. It actually boils down to, and in my episode, Compliance is Violence, Dickinson and Spooner on the Path to Liberty, it actually boils down to the people being willing to stand up for their Constitution and liberty, even when every level of government is against them. So even if you can't find the people, of course, it absolutely is much more helpful if you get local candidates that are good even on one issue, that are willing to take a stand on a single issue, much less a broad spectrum of constitutional issues. But certainly it's much less difficult to get things done when you can find them, like Veritas mentioned. But really, the linchpin, the foundation of all this is really the people's willingness to stand for liberty, to love liberty. First of all, as Samuel Adams told us in 1771, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So we have a serious education problem, and we have a serious backbone problem at the same time. We have an education problem in that most people love government. They love government programs. Even people who oppose government programs under this administration, they love government programs under a different one. They're just not against it across the board. And then you also have to understand and have the backbone. So we have a major problem on our hands that I just hope, I'm very cynical in the short term. I'm very hopeful for humanity in the long term. I just think it's going to get much worse before it gets better. But it is our duty to at least set the foundation and lead by example and show people the right way forward. Haji 1954 said, turn it off, Bluffdale, Utah. That was a great campaign and video. And the campaign still continues because we are we're continually pushing to get this done in other states. We know they're in Michigan. We got it signed into law. We're working on it in other places. In California, of all places, it was passed. It does need an amendment to actually be as impactful, because the way that they modeled it, the guy who introduced it and got it passed, it was actually signed by Jerry Brown. I wrote that model legislation so broad back in the day that it would have included FBI, DEA, and ATF offices, and I think they figured that out in the process, and then they watered it down. So I went too strong and then gave ourselves a problem where we have to actually do it again to get it improved. Anyway, so we're still working on that because it is a long-term project. If you believe in liberty, as Thomas Jefferson wrote to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. Haji also talks about equitable sharing. This is typical false and misleading label used by the feds and their collaborators. And they are collaborators when they're participating in this. Fred Middleton talks about the size of the government. Mount Everest in size, biggest ever. Largest threat to a state for not complying, tune of $30 trillion in debt. Until the debt is resolved, the downward spiral will continue to increase, respectively. Brutus. I believe it was Brutus. It could have been Cato. Now I'm getting them confused. My anti-federalist writers, and some people will tell you it's the same guy, but basically said, I can hardly imagine a greater calamity than for the nation to actually have more debt than it can repay. So that's an important point, Fred. I appreciate that. Liberty Revolutionary always endorse noncompliance. That is the key to it all. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it was at least fun to watch or listen to. I really appreciate you being here. Of course, don't forget the membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.